All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today, we are diving into the life and career of David Crosby, so stick around. All right, we've got a new music alert. My newest single, The Ballad of George and Dan, just dropped wherever you stream your tunes. I love this song. It's a true story I wrote about a road trip that my grandfather and his brother took back east to buy a motorcycle and then drive it home, and they didn't make it all the way. But it's a fun story, and it was a lot of fun to write. And big thanks to Will Mitchell and David West and everybody that helped put the music together for this thing. I really appreciate it, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. So please go check it out. That's The Ballad of George and Dan. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at TylerandCo_marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything. Everything. When he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. Marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. All right, so David Crosby is a very complicated character, and the more I kind of dug in here, it's a little conflicting, because on the one hand, he's a legendary musician. His vocal talent, his writing ability, his guitar playing, his contributions to to just the style of music in America can't be overstated. Like, he's a real integral piece of the puzzle. At the same time, he was a tough dude to get along with for a huge part of his career. And there's, you can go down the YouTube rabbit hole and find people talking about why they don't like David Crosby. And that's not that's not what I intend to do with the show. I'm not trying to, just bring up negative things about people, but it is a tough story, and he's kind of a tough cookie to, he's very prickly. So, but anyway, starts off, he's born in 1941 in Los Angeles. And his childhood is relatively, it's not as bad as some of these childhoods we've talked about in other episodes, but it's not great for him. His dad was a Oscar-winning movie director, but he was gone all the time. So he had this kind of absentee father for a giant chunk of his childhood. His early childhood, he remembers, his getting his musical knack was because his dad wouldn't allow them to really watch TV, because his dad was a movie guy. And back then there was a hard division between the two. And so instead of watching TV every night, the family was playing music, and David Crosby was picking up the ability to sing harmony by the time he was 6. And that talent stuck with him all the way through school. He goes to a boarding school at one point, and kind of he gets recognized for his voice pretty quick. But before that, he had kind of a tough go of it. He was he was smaller than a lot of the guys at the school. He was, he didn't have that kind of jock thing going on. He got picked on a lot. He was more kind of brainy and he wasn't reclusive in that way. He was always a great storyteller, and he's very outgoing, but he was getting picked on a lot in high school until he really leaned into the music, and that kind of set him up for social success here. But before that, there's a disconnect almost immediately between his intellectual ability and his ability to succeed at school. Like, there's a documentary where one of his friends is talking about how, like, David just didn't believe in doing homework, but then the two of them got interested in World War II, and they wrote a novel on World War II history just on their own, like, not anything to do with school, which is a wild thing for, a teenager to do. But that's kind of the way his brain worked, and he was a clearly sharp and gifted kid from the jump. And the part of the problem is he knew it. Like, his ego from a very early age was astonishingly big. And it would, like I said, it would lead to many of the problems, that he would run into later. So pretty early on so he graduates high school, and he'd been playing in bands and, like, local gigs and stuff. And, but pretty soon out of high school, he ends up getting his girlfriend pregnant, and he just pulls his chute and says, "Nope, I'm not ready to be a dad," and just walks out. And, that kid gets put up for adoption soon after. So that's kind of like, there's this sharp break in the timeline. First kid goes off and gets put up for adoption. He continues on, and he ends up back in LA. He went to Florida briefly, but he ends up back in LA. And this is where we start having the run-ins with the people we've talked about on the show. This is where the birds get going. And because him and Roger McGuinn and Chris Hillman and, all those guys, I think they met at the Troubadour, at, like, the open mic rounds at the Troubadour. And they kind of coalesce around that, and then they get a chance to record together, and the birds are born. And really quickly, so they experience a lot of success really fast. The birds were a huge deal relatively young into their career, because they kicked it off with Mr. Tambourine Man, which hit #1 really fast. And so with the fast success and money that came from that, there were no brakes on this operation when it came to the drugs and alcohol front. Like, they just, especially David Crosby, was full send, no rules, doing whatever he wanted to do to whoever he wanted to do it to, really early on. And he developed this reputation as being this, like, kind of the cool guy on the block, but it was, he was, like, he constantly, like, I think one quote was that, like, he always had the best grass, the best coke, and the prettiest women, and they were always naked. Was like, that's David Crosby walking around the music scene in the 60s. But because, all those guys have a pretty strong personality, to put it lightly, it starts causing issues. The most notable of which is when they hit the Monterey Pop Festival. And so, for context here, just before that had happened, we had the run-in with Graham Parsons, who had showed up to town on his first weekend in LA, went to David Crosby's house for a house party, and leaves with David Crosby's fiance. Like, showed up by himself, left with David Crosby's fiance. There's some differing accounts saying that they weren't engaged at the time, but some saying they were. But that's the woman that Graham Parsons has a daughter with. That's Polly Parsons' mom. And, so that had just happened. Then fast forward to the Monterey Festival, and this is where things really kind of boil over. And there's some wild videos you can find on YouTube about this. So basically what happens, the first strike against him, David Crosby gets out on stage and just goes full send, talking to the audience about what's branded as political stuff, but it was about the Kennedy assassination. And the funniest part about all this is that, for as abrasive and crazy as it was, he was kind of right. I mean, it's kind of stuff that we kind of accept as true for the most part. Like, he gets on stage and just kind of randomly is like, President Kennedy wasn't killed by a lone gunman. There were multiple shooters from multiple angles with multiple rifle calibers, and, like, and talking, and then, like, witnesses are being killed, and the Warren Commission is lying, and, it's being covered up, and this is your country, ladies and gentlemen, and gets, like, this kind of awkward, kind of half applause from the audience. So that was like strikes 1 and 2 basically. And people were furious. And Hillman and McGuinn were also furious. They're like, hey man, we're musicians. Like, this is not our job to come out here and start ranting about political stuff. Like, we're here to entertain people and play music and help them dance. And, but Crosby did not feel that way. He felt like he was bringing his art to the people. And like, I think he held his personal opinions at equal value as his art. So it's like, well, if the people want the art, then they obviously want that from me too. And he just gave it to him. And he was a lot like Neil Young in that way. Like him and Neil Young famously, we'll get to, they have a nasty falling out later, but they're so similar in their personality and their like kind of outlandishness. But like I said, so strike 1 and 2 were the political and, you know, Kennedy assassination things he was saying on stage. And because you got to imagine too, like now we kind of in with the benefit of hindsight, we all go, yeah, there's something funky going on with the Kennedy assassination. At the time, he might as well have got on stage and been like, Bush did 9/11. Like there's like, it's the same, it's the same level of, you know, kind of reaction you would get from people, despite the ringings of, you know, conspiracy theorist truths and things like that. It really jarred people when he said that at the time. And the next day at that festival is where we get that session where Buffalo Springfield, who Neil Young had just quit the band with like almost no notice, and he was supposed to be at that festival, but Neil Young wasn't there. So Stephen Stills, who had heard of Crosby, invites him on stage for the Buffalo Springfield set, and he does. So that really kind of put the nail in the coffin for the Byrds. Like Hillman and McGuinn were not into this at all. And this leads to a pretty famous interaction where after that had happened, and it was, and also like all of that in the context of it was that plus his general personality. He was so confrontational and so hard-nosed about creative decisions and recording decisions and harmony decisions, and he was like ruining recording sessions by like being finicky about one little harmony line or what, you know, he was just a nightmare at this time to deal with, and he'll tell you, like, you know, in later interviews that was the case. And so the rest of the Byrds load up in their Porsches and drive to Crosby's house and basically tell him he's out of the band. Like, I think they said, we'd like you to step down, which is basically you're fired. And he initially was telling them, like, you're making a big mistake. Like, he has a pretty... What's funny is that, like, it's the first real picture of that ego we're talking about. He doesn't apologize. He's not like, hey, listen, guys, I'm sorry, I was out of line. He's just like, you're making a big mistake. You're kicking out your biggest asset. Like, you know, kind of good riddance kind of thing. And so he's out of the Byrds. And this is where a little thing that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about that I keep coming back to. Soon after that happens is when Chris Hillman is in the bank and he just sees Graham Parsons, who I don't know, like, they didn't know each other. And I think the only interaction they might have had was the house party at which Graham stole Crosby's girlfriend. So I don't know how much of I would love to ask Chris Hillman about this. When he walks into the bank and sees Graham Parsons, is he thinking, oh, there's that really talented keyboard player? Or is he thinking, that's the guy we should replace David with? Because that would sting. So, because it did. I mean, that was a decision to get made. And so after the Monterey Festival, he leaves and he's replaced by Graham Parsons, and the Byrds go off and do their story that we've already covered on the show. And, but so soon after this is when, so this is 1968. This is the birth of Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And it was kind of the first super group because you had Stephen Stills from Buffalo Springfield, David Crosby from the Byrds, and Graham Nash from the Hollies, and they all kind of collect together and they start this group. And initially, it is phenomenal. The early Crosby, Stills, and Nash albums are just top notch as far as production and harmony quality and, you know, instrumentals. They're legendary for a reason. And initially, they would tell you, like, they could just get in a living room and do that. They don't have a bunch of fancy stuff going on. Like, the three of them with their guitars in a living room could put on a killer show, and they did on several occasions. But David's drug use at this point is causing a big problem. And I think there's a time where, so at some point here, 1969. So this is after he's with Crosby, Stills, and Nash. He had gotten into a relationship with a woman named Christine Hinton. And he went from being this like crazy different girl every night kind of rock star dude to being in this kind of committed monogamous relationship that he seemed to be really into. He really loved that lady. And that was going, that was a really good positive impact on his life. And then tragedy just comes a knocking for really the first big tragedy for David Crosby here, because his girlfriend throws the cats in the car to go take him to the vet, and she's driving down the road, and it sounds like one of the cats jumped in her lap and did something happened driving down the road, and she crashes and dies. And David Crosby has to go to the hospital and identify her body, and it completely destroys him. Like there's a bunch of different people that'll say like David went to identify her body, and that's the last time we ever saw that version of David. He was a different dude when he came back from that. And he says later that he just did not have the tools at his disposal to deal with that he was just unequipped completely to deal with a loss of that magnitude. And so he just spirals. I mean, he gets to the point where he burns a hole through his nose from doing so much coke. And then his remedy to that was to start freebasing. So he's smoking crack in green rooms backstage and wherever, like, as if it's not a problem. He's like not really even trying to hide it that much. Like at one point he messed up, I think they were on stage, and his crack pipe falls off an amp and shatters on the floor. And he like stops the music and like it's this big fall apart. And his friends start to realize that this is a real problem, and that like, despite the fact that it hadn't affected his music up to then, even though it really had, there's some performances you can pick him out even before this where he's not in good shape. And but and the band starts doing its like break up, get back together thing pretty early on here too, and it's largely because of David Crosby's drug use. I mean, he is an absolute nightmare to be around. He's kind of doing the same thing George Jones was doing there for a second, where he's like, the crack is making him very paranoid, as it tends to do. So David Crosby is walking around strung out, angry. He's already a mean dude, and now he's paranoid, and he starts packing a gun around. And so that became like his thing, was just like he carried a gun with him everywhere, and he was super confrontational with people. He never shoots anybody. I don't think he ever even like brandishes the gun at anybody. I don't think. But people know that it's around. So he's kind of just this wild card, dangerous dude to have around. And this is where Neil Young kind of rejoins the picture here. And let's see here. In 1973, this is when McGuinn reunites the original Byrds. So he gets David Crosby back, and him and Hillman, and they get the Byrds back together for one album. But again, it kind of falls apart because of personalities. And so the Byrds don't last very long here in 1973, which I think is kind of like, I wonder how McGuinn and Hillman look back on that, because if you remember 1973, when this happened, Roger McGuinn disbanded the the Byrds, when that included Clarence White and Gene Clark and those guys. So like the Byrds had kept performing and kept recording and doing their thing, but then when McGuinn hears that David Crosby and Chris Hillman are open to coming back and they're available, he disbands Clarence White and Gene Clark and brings back Hillman and Crosby. I think the Byrds could have kept going if he hadn't done that. Like, if he hadn't made that decision and he'd have just stuck with Clarence and Gene and the rest of them, like, they probably could have kept going. I don't know, because I know that Clarence White was like sad about that. It wasn't something that he saw coming, I don't think. So McGuinn disbands that version of the Byrds, recreates the original 5 members, and it only lasts for like a year, maybe not even that. And so then in 1973, also, this is where, like, right after that happens, this is where you get the death of Clarence White, because he was back playing in his bluegrass band instead of being with the Byrds, and he gets struck and killed and, you know, out behind the venue. So, and that you know, peels off into the Graham Parsons death story. But so right after that time window happens, we're into 1974. And this is where Neil Young joins the picture, and this is where you start getting Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. And again, legendary albums come out of this thing. And initially, they're all thick as thieves, and it's going great. But it's only like that for a little while because their personalities just do not gel. And him and Neil Young, Crosby and Neil Young specifically, like I said, they're both these like wild card, out front, super assertive, kind of bombastic's not the right word, but they're both like not afraid of confrontation at all. And they're willing to just walk away from stuff. Like I said, like, you know, Neil Young just bailed on Buffalo Springfield for no reason, basically. He just, you know, I mean, not no reason. It was his own personal reasons, but it surprised everybody else. And he would do that a few times over the course of his career. But it was a little bit different for Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young when they brought him in. They were all also working on side solo projects at the time. Like, they weren't, like, that was not a deal breaker for them. They all thought of themselves as a super group made of all these top-notch dudes who were also free to go do whatever else they wanted. But like I said, it was not sunshine and daisies for very long. But this is where you get they write because the Kent State Massacre happens, and there's I think it was a Time magazine cover that David Crosby was reading, and he shows it to Neil Young, and he's there in that moment where he sees the light switch go off in Neil Young's brain when he writes Ohio, which is the song about the Kent State Massacre. And because that was right up both of their alleys. Like, they were both super politically involved. And there's interviews later, like there's a great documentary out that David Crosby did, I think in 2019. And I don't exactly know where he's standing. It might be at Kent State or somewhere, but there's this picture on the wall of National Guard people shooting into a crowd, which is a wild picture. And David Crosby is like a 70-something or 80-something-year-old man banging his finger on the wall, pointing at this picture, because the fact that this picture is blasted on the wall here is nuts, because it shows the lead, like, National Guardsman holding a pistol, and the picture happened to catch the slide on the pistol recoiling during a shot, which is a split-second thing. Like, for the camera to catch that is... the odds of that, like, if you sat down and tried to, like, film someone, like, all right, I'm going to take a picture while the slide is to the rear on your pistol, you're not going to get that picture done. Like, if you try, it's not going to happen. Especially in the 70s. Like, cameras are not that good. But it just happens to catch this dude's pistol mid-cycle, and David Crosby is banging his finger on the wall, being like, this son of a gun never went to court. He claimed he never fired his pistol, but we have it right here in this picture. And he's fired up about it decades after it happened, which, you know, pretty good thing to be fired up about, I guess. But you can see how much it meant to him at the time. And, but anyway, so back to 1974, or 1976. So those couple of years here, this is where we start to get our first breaks in Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. We're like, it's so difficult to be around each other. Crosby's drug problem is causing a giant issue. Stephen Stills is a real drinker at the time. They're all doing drugs and alcohol, but the two problem children on that department were David Crosby and Stephen Stills. And they quickly get to a point where they can't really stand to be around each other. And which is ironic, because Stephen Stills is the one that started it all off by inviting David Crosby onto the set for Buffalo Springfield, which he was only able to do because Neil Young didn't show up. So there's this weird knot of interactions here. But like I said, it's kind of a through the 70s here, for the rest of that, from 76 when they first break up, they do a tour in 77, but like without Neil Young. And then there's a bunch of bad blood about Neil Young not being invited to things and like kind of the decisions that get made around who's playing where. And it gets pretty complicated and kind of just, this is where the nastiness really starts to build. And then in 1985, they perform at Live Aid, and the video of that, Crosby is in the throes of addiction here. Like, he's bumbling around on stage. His voice is just terrible. This is kind of the dark years of Crosby, Stills, and Nash. People that went to those concerts are just like heartbroken because it's such a train wreck so early on. And also he'd also gone to jail at one point for drug possession and illegal firearm possession. He did like 9 months in jail. I think it was back in the 70s. But so here we go. 1985. It all comes crashing down. Now, one of the things that Crosby had done, especially after the death of his girlfriend, before, he decided that he wanted to just go out and be on the ocean. So he goes and buys a sailboat and just proceeds to have this period of time where he's just sailing around, doing drugs, drinking himself half to death. And Graham Nash, through this time, Graham Nash latches onto him and is like just trying to be his friend. They were really close during this time. Even when Stephen Stills and him were having issues, Graham Nash really tried to be the mediator. And there was 40 years here where they're like talking every day, and Graham is really trying to help him out. And Graham ends up on that boat with him. And to watch Graham Nash describe this period of time is so heartbreaking, because he's just talking about, like, I tried doing less drugs than him. I tried doing more drugs than him. I tried doing the same amount of drugs as him and trying to, like, lead him out of it. And he's like, it was just not going to happen. Like, he was just so self-destructive, and there was nothing that was going to pull him out of that. And then 1986. Also, by the way, before I get to this, when he buys that sailboat, another window into how much he hadn't changed much later. So so when you watch his documentary in 2019, he's talking back on all these things, and you realize how much that guy, he does get much better, and his life does improve later. But even in his later days, he's kind of got this mean streak to him, and he's very, like, you can see that self-centeredness kind of ringing through still. Because he's telling the story about this sailboat, and he found this boat that was for sale, but he couldn't afford it. He had no money, by the way, because he's spending all of his money on drugs and alcohol. And so he starts a rumor in the town that there's something wrong with this boat, that there was like rot under the keel or something, and it was like it would be expensive to fix. And so he just starts a rumor around town to drop the price of the boat to where he could afford it with money that he borrows from a friend. He borrows $25,000 and swoops this boat after he started a total lie about the condition of the thing. When he tells that story, he doesn't have any like, that was kind of, he was just like, oh yeah, so the smart thing to do was I started this rumor and knocked a bunch of money off the price. And, but anyway, so he gets this sailboat, and it becomes his escape, really. Like, he spends a lot of time on this sailboat over the next, few years. And then here we go, 1986. He gets arrested for drunk driving. He like a hit and run, I think, on a parked car. And when he gets caught, he's got a pistol in the car that he's not supposed to have, and there's all this. So this is the end of the road for him. Like, he knows, I'm going to jail again. And he decides to run for it. So he just dips out, leaves town. His idea was, I'm going to go to Florida, get on my boat, and we're going to sail around the world, and that's it. And at the time, he had a girlfriend named Jan Dance, who at the time was just as messed up as him. Like, he kind of introduced her to freebasing cocaine too at the time. Like that, they were both addicts together, despite the fact that they really did love each other, and that relationship will survive this thing and for many decades. But initially, it was this very unhealthy. Both of them are addicted. Both of them are doing crazy stuff all the time. And so when he gets arrested for drunk driving, instead of reporting to court, he leaves town. And the idea was, we're going to get to the boat, we're going to sail away and live happily ever after. Well, because of his drinking and alcohol use, he had not sent any money in to take care of his boat. And it had rotted to the point of not being usable. So he gets to his boat, realizes this is not an option, he can't flee the country, and he kind of has an end of the road moment, and he decides, all right, I'm going to turn myself in. So he walks into a local FBI office. He walks into a local FBI office and turns himself in and tells this kind of funny story about walking into the FBI office. And he's like, I think you guys might be looking for me. And remember, this is in Florida. I think he got arrested in New York, I think. And so he makes it to Florida. And as soon as he says, I'm David Crosby, they go, oh, yeah, hands on the wall. And sure enough, lock him up. He goes to prison. And I think he does 9 months, I think. He's in there for, 9 months in prison in Texas, by the way. And which I don't exactly understand how that worked out, but they sent him to the Texas Department of Corrections. And this is one of those weird times where incarceration kind of worked. It gave him enough time to dry out, because there had been other, Graham Nash and, all of his friends had tried, and I think Jackson Brown was there for one of these interventions. They had tried to pull legit interventions and fly him to treatment, and, and he would go, and then he would get out of treatment after a month, and his first phone call was to his dealer. None of it stuck. He just full self-destruct mode all the way. And, but this time in 1986, he's locked up for enough time to really dry out. He starts writing again. He kind of remembers who he is. He starts kind of correcting his life a little bit. And so things start to kind of turn around for him. And then, ironically, I didn't even realize that a judge could do this, but one of his, part of his sentencing was he wasn't supposed to contact Jan Dance, his girlfriend. But after he gets out of prison and some time goes by, they write a letter to the judge and basically say, look, we're both sober now, we're both doing really good, and we would like to get married. Can you please lift this no contact order thing? And the judge does, which I thought was interesting, because he did not have to do that, but this judge allows them to get married. And like I said, that, they stay married until his death in 2022, or 2023. And so that seemed to work out, and they both remain sober for the rest of his life, other than marijuana, so I guess he's California sober, I guess is what you would call that, because he looked at that as more of a medicine. So he gets out of prison, he starts going through, the 80s and 90s here, and he starts he started performing live again immediately after getting out of prison. He's back on the scene. And he gets back with Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and they, but the same things keep happening, same conflicts of personality. And that doesn't last very long. And this is where there's somewhere in here, I think it was 1994. Well, two things happened in 1994. The most serious of which is he's hospitalized for hepatitis C liver failure. So he needs a liver transplant, which is, he looked back on that as why would God do this to me? As soon as I got my life together, now you're going to kill me kind of thing. And he stayed in the hospital for a long time there waiting on a liver transplant. He's on death's door waiting for a liver transplant. While he's there, I'm not exactly sure of the order here. He's still in the hospital, but so two things happen. Phil Collins steps in and pays for his liver transplant when they find a donor. So he does get a new liver because of Phil Collins. And while either right before that happened or when he's recovering after, I'm not 100% sure. This is where his son from that first pregnancy, way back right out of high school, who had gotten put up for adoption, found out that and that guy had gone on to have his life was great. He was raised by loving parents. And then after he graduated high school, he wanted to find out who his birth parents were. And he finds out that his dad is David Crosby, which is, imagine that phone call. And, cause he was a talented musician and on his own he was a keyboard player. And so while Crosby's in the hospital, he just got a new liver. He meets his biological son that he had ran out on, 20 something years before this. So he starts to kind of get this new lease on life thing going on. And like I said, he's continuing to play, he's continuing to tour. That son, I think his name is Raymond. No, James. His name is James. So him and James team up and start performing together when he starts a band called CPR. And that's James, his long-lost son, playing keyboard and singing with him. And then you get down to like that's in the 90s. A little kind of weird, not weird, but like an interesting side note here. Melissa Etheridge, who is an actress, and her wife decide they want to have a baby, and they think that David Crosby would be a good sperm donor for them. I don't know how that decision gets made. I don't know. Like, they were close friends, obviously, and because David Crosby and Jan Dance had a son, their own son in the years prior to, in the mid 90s, I think they had a son. And that kid seemed to be like a good, like healthy functioning kid. And so Melissa Etheridge decides that David Crosby would be a good sperm donor for her and her wife. And sadly, so they get twins out of that deal. And sadly, one of them goes on to die of, I think, opioid overdose when he's like 21 or something. But so he had some of the same problems going on. But anyway, so then in 2004, CPR disbands, and Crosby and Nash released their own album because there's enough conflict going on here. And then we get David Crosby's last run-in with the law in 2004, where he is charged with another weapon possession, because now he's a felon. He's not supposed to have anything, but he's got a gun, a knife, and a bunch of marijuana in the car in New York when that's not allowed. And he pleads guilty. He's fined $5,000 and he's not put in jail. So, I think, I want to say he crashed his car again when that happened, but he didn't get a DUI. I'm not exactly sure the story on how he got arrested for that. But anyway, so that's kind of his last run-in with the laws in 2004. And we start getting into pretty recent history here, where I think it's 2016, might be before that. Neil Young's wife dies. Well, that's another whole complicated story, where Neil Young gets divorced from a woman he'd been married to for like 40 years. A few years later, she dies, and Neil Young starts dating an actress whose name is not right in front of me, but I should remember. But they're filming this documentary about Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young at the time, and they're doing interviews and everything else. And in an interview, David Crosby says, "Oh yeah, Neil's involved." I think he called her a poisonous predator of a person or some words to that effect. And he would later say, "Oh, I thought that was off the record." They print that, and Neil Young is furious. And he's like, "Nope, I'm totally done playing with you. We'll never speak again." And years later, David Crosby does apologize, and he tries to, make amends with Neil Young. But then Neil Young is like, "All right, well, why don't you print something up in a magazine like you did when you trashed my girlfriend? Like, put it in print, and then maybe we'll talk." And David Crosby wouldn't do it. So things did not get mended there. And during this period of time, too, is like Stephen Stills, his drinking continued to be an issue the whole time. So even when they got back together to do stuff, they're fighting on stage. They're yelling at each other. Like, there's really tragic footage of, like, and then even his relationship with Graham Nash falls apart in here. And this is Graham Nash, who'd been his best friend for 40 years and was trying to help him survive his drug addiction. Things fall apart so badly. At one point, they're on stage, and he's in his face screaming at David Crosby about, like, you don't get it, I hate you, like this, like on stage in front of people. They're having a full come apart, and like their harmonies are falling apart. They do this Christmas lighting ceremony where they try to sing Silent Night, but nobody can hear themselves, and so they all sound in a totally, they're all off key. The guitar is playing the wrong notes. Like it's just a disaster, and it was so disappointing to everybody. And like right before that happened, like I think it was that same ceremony, like as they're talking, they all had these like cards to read, but they got them swapped up, and Stephen Stills reads Crosby's lines, I think is how it went. Like one of them read the other's lines, and it kind of jammed up the flow of things. David Crosby, who is supposed to be at this point like sober and living a much better life, pulls a pick off of the mic stand and like throws it at Stephen Stills, and they just start, and Graham Nash and them, and they all start yelling at each other. Like it, this whole time here, the tragedy of it is that Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young never really patch things up. They all give interviews saying how that would be nice, and like, but not Neil Young. Neil Young never says, oh yeah, maybe we could start singing together again. But there are interviews, especially with Graham Nash, when he's like, initially he's like, nope, don't call me, like, nope, it's over. And then in other interviews, he kind of seems a little bit more open to the idea of working together, but really it never gets righted here. And what I found, you know, the tragedy of it all here is that when they do this documentary in 2019, you know, David Crosby seems to feel like playing music is the only thing he's good for, and that like that's enough of an apology to the world. So he like acknowledges that he was a nightmare to deal with, and he's trying to be a better person, but he also is not actually doing anything to resolve those conflicts at this stage. So it's a very tough, sad end to a very astounding career of music. Because then in 2023 he gets COVID, and that's what kills David Crosby at the age of 81. So like I said, just a kind of tragic fizzle out to this career full of high notes, but also just self-destructive ego conflicts that would really just, they would never recover from. But that's it for old David Crosby. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you next week.